Hi, good day. I'm so glad you're here joining us. Lia Mills. I said that wrong. Okay,
It's
say
all
it.
good.
Say it for me, Leah.
Malusis.
Malusis. Yes. Okay. Thank you very much. Leah Malusis is here with me today. She's a human rights lawyer, a motivational speaker, and a self-published author. She graduated from the University of Ottawa with a joint honors specialization in women's studies and political science, and completed her law degree at the University of Ottawa, graduating with a specialization in social justice. Lia first stepped onto the stage of activism at the age of 12 under the pseudonym of Lia Mills when a video of her speech about abortion went viral on YouTube. So, Lia, I'm so glad you're here with me today. Thank you so much for joining me.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me, Nicole. It's a pleasure.
Well, let's talk about that speech when you were 12. What motivated you to make or write the speech, deliver the speech?
Yeah, so there was a project. I was going to a public school in Toronto at the time, and there was a project that we were required as a class to do as part of my English class. And we were supposed to write a 5-minute speech about any topic we wanted. And so that was kind of what motivated the speech component. But in terms of the topic itself, there were two things. So, one, we were told we could write about anything we wanted, which for an indecisive person like me was just way too many options. And the other side of things from my perspective was that there was this competition that I really wanted to win. So there was the school project, but also a competition. And I thought, I if I'm going to do all this work, I would like for it to be about something meaningful. And so I had thought about some other human rights issues that we had talked about in class, but I decided in the end that I was just going to pray. And I believed, that God would help me answer this question and this dilemma of what I should write about. And so when I prayed, he suggested the topic of abortion, which for me was not a familiar issue. I wasn't raised in a home that was actively pro-life, and I'd really not talked about this issue before. I'd never heard about it in school. And so I was kind of naive when I said, that sounds like a good topic. But it was at that point when I first started doing research that I found out that in Canada, we have no laws on the issue of abortion. I found out what abortion actually was, and that it happens, an estimated 100,000 times in Canada and millions of times around the world. And so it was at that point that I found myself being very surprised that this was something I hadn't heard about. I almost wondered whether it was even worth talking about, because I kind of thought, in my naivety, that everyone would agree that, ending the life of a baby was wrong. Because from my perspective, there's a baby, the baby's life matters, abortion ends the life of this baby. And so my understanding was pretty black and white in that respect at the time. And so I thought that it might not even be worth talking about, because surely everyone was on the same page. But doing additional research, I realized that there was actually a really big debate about this. And so at that point I concluded, I had to talk about this. I became very passionate about it very quickly. I was always a pretty justice oriented child. And when I went to my teacher, recalled that I was in a public school, and my teacher said, that she was pro-choice, that she didn't think there was anything wrong with abortion, that some of her friends had had abortions, and that if I wanted to write about this topic, I would be disqualified from the competition because it was just too big, too mature, and way too controversial. And that was a big challenge for me, because recall that I was really excited about this competition. And so I struggled with that decision for a week or two. But in the end, I felt like I had just discovered this huge injustice that no one in my life was talking about, at least not that I was aware of. And I really felt like it was something that God had called me to speak to. So I ended up writing the speech and going on and sharing it with my class and my school. I ended up getting put back in the competition, but then disqualified, kind of back and forth, just for a bunch of different reasons. But that was the reason I originally wrote about the issue. And the video, which I think we'll be looking at a clip of.
Yeah, we'll look at it quickly.
Yeah, but the video was really just, my parents, who thought that I did a really good job, even though originally they were not supportive of me writing about this, because again, they just thought it was way too controversial and certainly beyond, what we were comfortable with with talking about as a family, they thought that I did a great job and just wanted to show some friends, and so we really just recorded the video to send to a few family friends, church friends, and at that point it went viral accidentally on YouTube, and I think to this day it has about 3 million views. So it was an accidental introduction into the issue of abortion, but it's become an area that I'm really passionate about. So
Okay, well, let's stop there and let's take a look at 12-year-old Lia and see
awesome.
what she has to tell us.
What if I told you that right now someone was choosing if you were going to live or die? What if I told you that this choice wasn't based on what you could or couldn't do, what you've done in the past, or what you would do in the future? And what if I told you you could do nothing about it? Fellow students and teachers, thousands of children are right now in that very situation. Someone is choosing, without even knowing them, whether they are going to live or die. That someone is their mother, and that choice is abortion. Every day, 115,000 children are dying through abortion. 115,000. That means that 5,000 children would die every hour. All those lives gone. All that potential gone. And all that hope and future gone.
Okay, so let's just pause there and talk about that. So when you presented that, it has a great hook. How was it received by your classmates and the staff at your school?
Yeah, so my classmates, I was actually very surprised when I first started, because it wasn't that I just had the speech, I had to do all the research on my own and write the speech on my own. And so as I was going through that process, and I was a very talkative child and sharing with my classmates, I found that most of them had already heard about this issue and were already very supportive of abortion. And I was very surprised because I hadn't heard about this issue, and so I wasn't sure where they had heard it in school or maybe elsewhere, but I was surprised at how many of them were already very supportive of abortion. But they were also very supportive of me, and I think they understood, because of the way I approached it was not a condemnatory place or a judgmental place, but really just worried about women and the impact of abortion on women as well as on the child. I think there was a lot of productive conversation that actually happened. We were very talkative children. I was in the gifted program, and so it just became a point of conversation. And I think a number of the students found that the having that speech and having that conversation was very thought provoking for them. And so my classmates all received it quite well. There was no opposition or anger from any of them, really. And the teachers, not so much. So my teacher ended up, despite her initial opposition, she ended up becoming just a huge support to me. And she was, there was no type of bias or discrimination on her part. She was an incredible resource and really helped me even in making some suggestions about how to make it more powerful, because it was a speech writing project. And so she was an amazing teacher, and she ended up facing a lot of opposition actually from some of the other teachers in the school who, when I went to the school level and then eventually the regional level, many of the teachers didn't want that speech, my speech, to win. A number of them tried to make it sound like someone else had won, and there was at least one judge in particular who refused to even listen to it. So she faced a lot of opposition actually from some of the other teachers in the school administration, and so I think the teachers had a harder time accepting it, and I found that very frustrating at the time, because I said, you guys were the ones that gave me this speech project, and I figured, surely if you're giving me this project, you want to actually hear what I have to say. So I found that very interesting. But in terms of my class itself and my teacher, they were hugely supportive in the end.
So when they were saying they just didn't even want to hear it, did they give you a reason, or was it just that the topic was so challenging for them?
Yeah, well, I think you know, I consider from now, I mean, I don't know exactly because obviously
For sure.
these teachers weren't speaking to me directly. It was all kind of information that I was finding out from my teacher, who was, you know, my impromptu advocate, despite her actual opposition to my position and my stance on the issue. But yeah, I would say there were a few things. One, I mentioned in the speech, I was careful to you know, be conscious and cognizant of the religious diversity in the school. So I never mentioned God outright. I just referenced the creator. But for some of the teachers, that was too religious. And so there was actually a point at which I was disqualified and then afterwards requalified, but I was disqualified if I didn't take that wording out. And so that became its kind of own point of contention. But I got the sense that just in light of it being a public school in Toronto, which tends to be, you know, a very progressive and liberal-minded city, there seemed to be a sense that this was not a pro-life position, was not one that was acceptable for the school to be putting forward at the regional competition. And so there seemed to kind of be this I guess, question of what does it say about us as a school and what does it say about us as teachers at this school if we put this forward as the speech that won at the grade 7 level, because there was also a grade 8 level. So those are just that's my theory. And I think I understand to some extent it's challenging, especially if they thought that there was some complexity that I wasn't addressing in my speech, although I was limited because it was only 5 minutes. But I think that it was saddening to me that there were people who didn't even want to hear it or didn't want to even have that conversation, because it was by no means impossible to have that conversation. And actually, I think my class was the perfect example of people who mostly disagreed with me, but we were able to still come together at the age of 12 and 13 and have, you know, interesting, productive conversations where we all left friends for the most part, but we're able to engage on this issue. And so I think, yeah, I appreciated how my class approached it, and it was unfortunate that other teachers just weren't able to get to that place.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's kind of an example of what we're even facing today in society, where adults cannot dialogue about issues that they don't necessarily agree with each other on, but find a place of kind of common civility where they can talk. And it's interesting that it was able to happen in your classroom, but not between the so-called adults in the room.
Sure. Yeah. Well, and I wonder even, you know, even as we're talking about it, I'm thinking one of the things that my teacher had mentioned specifically was that there were a number of people in her life who had had abortions. And I suspect that none of the students in my class would have known if that was true. They wouldn't have known if there was someone in their life who had had an abortion. So I think for them, it would have not been a personal issue. At no point did anyone suggest that they had had an abortion. And so it seemed to kind of be more of an academic conversation. And we were able to keep it at that level. Very lively, very passionate, but still more on the academic side. Whereas I think often with this issue, there's, you know, there are the so-called head arguments where you're dealing with kind of the logic and the questions of humanity and personhood, but then there are also the heart issues of, well, what does this mean? If I say that I'm against abortion, what does this communicate to the people in my life who've had abortions? And and how do I support them as individuals while maybe disagreeing with what they chose to do? And I think my teacher seemed to navigate that really well and was able to find a balance. And I laud her for that, because she really, you know, was able to stick with what she believed to be true while also supporting me as someone who disagreed with her. And that's a challenging thing, but I think that would be another theory, perhaps, that for a number of those adults, it would have become more of a personal issue and less of a friendly academic conversation.
Sure. Yeah. And I think that is probably one of the biggest challenges we face in discussing the issue around abortion is, well, especially if you have people in your life that you love and care about who've had an abortion, it's hard to then separate that for many people. And it does make the conversation more challenging. But since the time of the video, then you've gone on in your life. You have expanded your passion for social justice. You now includes speaking about topics like euthanasia, assisted suicide, human trafficking. You've gone and done a ton of other things, but along the way, before we get to maybe some of those later things, you wrote a book called An Inconvenient Life. Do you want to tell me a little bit about that and why you wrote it and what it was about?
Yeah, for sure. So the title is kind of a description of what my introduction into the issue of abortion was, which was it kind of came out of nowhere, and it was kind of inconvenient in that it changed my whole family dynamic. You know, my poor mom ended up fielding a lot of requests for me to speak and award applications and just, you know, all manner of things, and my family really was kind of got caught up in this big, you know, controversy that we didn't intend to, and so it was a little inconvenient in that respect, and so the title's a bit of a play on that, but also on the fact that when you're dealing with, you know, a crisis or unplanned pregnancy, there is this inconvenience element, and I think for a lot of people that disruption is very challenging. And so the book does a few different things. First of all, I really wanted to clarify a lot of misconceptions about why I got involved with the issue of abortion, how I got involved. There were a lot of people who blamed my parents for indoctrinating me and forcing me to write this speech, and kind of acted as though, you know, I was a pawn on the part of my parents or the church that I went to. And what's fascinating is that they actually couldn't have, like, they were very opposed, but they also couldn't help me write the speech just because it was a school project. And so my teacher was very strict about that, which makes perfect sense in light of it being, you know, supposed to be an educational experience. And so I wasn't allowed to get help from anyone except, you know, small conversations with my teacher who, you know, offered her input in an appropriate manner. And so it really, my hope was to try to set the record straight, because there were a lot of people who launched a lot of unfounded accusations. And the reason I went by a pseudonym for so long was because when we put the video online and just to show some people, and it went viral, we ended up getting so many death threats against me, and, you know, threats of sexual assault and just really, really graphic comments that were being made, that my parents were very concerned for my safety. So part of that, my book also explains what that was like, just how shocking it is as a 12-year-old to know that there are people who, you know, if you believe them and take them at their word, they want you to die, or they want you to be, you know, hurt in very deep personal ways by people in your family. Like that was a big challenge for me, and it especially became a challenge when I was 14 and people found out what my real name was and where my family lived, and, you know, the contact information for my siblings. And so my family and I actually moved because it became a safety risk. So I go by my real name now, which is so liberating and wonderful. Although it is a little harder to say than Lia Mills. But it was a challenge. And so part of the book just shares that personal element. But also, you know, I mentioned I was a little naive when I started. I wasn't familiar with some of the more intricate questions, like what do you do in the case of a rape or ectopic pregnancies, or the life of the mother being in danger. And all of those were questions that people asked me, and I had to find answers to. And unfortunately, I didn't have very many pro-life people in my life. And so I wasn't able to just go, you know, ask you, Nicole, and get that learned, wise answer. I had to do a lot of this research and this work on my own. And so part of what the book does is just compiles a lot of that information and tries to make it accessible, especially to young people. And then the last part of my book shares a little bit more about where I've gone and how I now articulate my pro-life worldview. Because as you mentioned in reading my bio, I went on into a feminism program. And so I studied women's studies as well as political science. And there were most of my colleagues, again, I found myself in a space where most people disagreed with me. And so I started to get creative in terms of how I expressed my pro-life worldview to people. And I started saying, you know, I am pro-woman, I am pro-choice, and I'm pro-life. And that would often just kind of create enough confusion that we were able to have a productive conversation, instead of it being this, you know, well, I'm pro-choice, and if you're pro-life, you're evil, or vice versa. And so I found that that using that language was very helpful. And so I share about that in the book and just kind of explain why I adopted that language, why so much of my pro-life work is informed by my love of women and the women in my life who have had abortions, who have been hurt and traumatized by abortion, who were pressured into abortions, or even if they chose to have their child, were made to feel like it was not a good choice, or not really a choice to keep their child and raise their child as a single parent, for example. So a lot of my pro-life worldview is informed by my genuine love of women and my my own traditional feminist orientation. And so I share that at the end, both to try to build bridges with those who care about women and come from a feminist background, but also to try to shape the ways that we as pro-lifers talk about our worldview, because sometimes there are ways that you can explain your beliefs that are kind of ostracizing, and there are ways that can be bridge building. And so that was my hope with that final section of my book. So yeah, it does a few different things, but that's a bit of a crash course.
Yeah, no, for sure. Thank you. So I really like how you've gone into this whole idea of, and I don't know if you get into the book or if this is a new development, but talking about using art and creating beautiful things as a way to exculpate your pro-life worldview, making it more explicit. So actually, I want to share a screenshot of this is from one of your videos. It's a spoken word. So why don't you just tell us a little bit about that and how that works?
Yeah, in terms of spoken word poetry?
Yes, yeah.
Yeah, well, I don't know that I consider myself, a fancy poet, but the vision for this, it was actually based on another spoken word I saw. I think why I hate religion but love Jesus, or why I love Jesus but hate religion. And I was inspired by that, and just recognized the power that comes in there being a spoken word element, and there being poetry and fluidity and creativity, instead of just some of the more logical arguments. And so so the vision behind it was really just expressing some of these ideas that I had, and the beliefs that I held, pro-life worldview, a love of women, but all in a way that was more engaging than just sitting down and listening to a 10-minute speech. So that was the vision behind the video. And I think I just kind of had a God-given grace for the season. I don't usually write spoken word poetry, so it was just my first stab at it. But yeah, I was pretty pleased with the outcome, and I think it's just a different way of engaging a different audience.
So you've done a lot of different things, video, poetry, in terms of your activism. Where do you see the pro-life movement needing to go in order to build those bridges, in order to make the language more accessible and have those dialogues? What do you think that the movement should be focusing on?
So honestly, it's hard to say specifically, because there are so many areas I think that work needs to be done. And so I almost reach for just like a diversity and a pluralism. I think historically a lot of pro-life advocacy has been done in specifically through kind of more apologetics methods, or maybe through books. And I love books, and so I will never turn down a book. But I think that there is a whole other space in the media, the arts, entertainment, that has been left for the most part to more of the pro-abortion or the pro-choice worldview. And then the other thing I'd say is I'm a person who is a person of faith, and my faith informs everything I do. And so it's not really possible for me to separate the two. But I do think that historically, the ways that pro-life people have expressed some of their beliefs have not always been able to speak across differences, and have kind of run up against challenges when speaking to someone who might not care what the Bible says. And so you might disagree and think that they should really care, and that's fair. That's a separate conversation maybe, but I think that there needs to kind of be this diversity in who is speaking and how we're speaking. And so I think generally I've seen more recently a shift from not just speaking to the head arguments and sharing the logical arguments of why, an unborn child is human and therefore why abortion is not justified. And those are very persuasive and winsome for me. But there are also, like I said, those hard arguments of how do you address those personal stories? How do you share stories of beauty and life and victory over crisis pregnancies or unplanned pregnancies, and the beautiful lives that come from those awful and challenging experiences. And so I would almost just say there needs to kind of be this diversity. I think before we were really kind of in one section, and now I'm seeing more organizations diversify in terms of who is running them, how they're running them. And I have focused a little bit more on the pro-life feminist angle because that's my academic background. But I think right now I personally am really seeing the value of media, which is challenging because I don't think of myself necessarily as a super, tech savvy media person, but I do think that there is a beauty that comes in poetry, in art, and I think we see those who support abortion using those really well. And I think there's something that we can learn from that and try to kind of get involved in these spaces because that's where a lot of young people are right now. They're on TikTok and Instagram and these kinds of things, which I don't have either of those. And so it's hard to know how to interact with those spaces. But I do think that there's an arts and culture and visual component that my generation, and the one younger than me is really engaging in. So we kind of need to go where they are to some extent.
Okay, so just one final question, because I think there's a word or a phrase that we often hear, or I've been hearing a lot lately, is making abortion unthinkable. Mm-hmm. And I think this is that people who are pro-choice think that you're going to make abortion unthinkable by legislating it out of existence.
Yeah.
And I would say that's not what I think making abortion unthinkable means. I think it means creating such a support network and such a love for the child that a mother feels supported and doesn't think that that's her only option. I guess when you talk about that, how do you bridge the gap on that language, and what do you think that means?
Yeah. So making abortion unnecessary and unthinkable. Those tend to be the two words that I use. Unnecessary because I think, and we Nicole, you and I have even talked about this in the context of euthanasia-assisted suicide, the way that every case of these things is demonstration of a failure of the healthcare system. And I'd say similarly, every situation where a woman, because the cases that people really are worried about are kind of the crisis cases, where there has been abuse, there's been trauma, there's unemployment, homelessness, violence, etc. It's the crisis pregnancy situations that people are really concerned about. And I think every time a woman has an abortion in those contexts, we've actually failed to address the crisis, because the crisis is not the pregnancy. If that pregnancy was taking place in a different context, if she had more support from her family, if she had more support from her community, and statistics show this, that she would not have an abortion. And so to some extent, our society has offered abortion to women as though it solves all these problems. And, you're 16, you're homeless, you're in an abusive relationship, and you get unexpectedly pregnant. This is the go-to solution. Now you don't have to worry about that crisis. But really, that's not empowering to her, because she's still in an abusive relationship and she's still homeless. And what does it say about our society that the best we could offer her was an abortion and not ending those crisis-inducing factors? And so I think when I say, making abortion unnecessary and unthinkable, the unnecessary component is really like we should be addressing these social phenomena that are indirectly pressuring and coercing women into having abortions, as well as addressing the very direct coercion and pressure that a lot of women experience. And I can think of many women in my life who were forced to have abortions, which is by no means empowering. I also, I think, and this is maybe a separate conversation, but abortion itself is being used to perpetuate a lot of discrimination in terms of ableism, sexism, and just eugenics generally. And so that's kind of the unthinkable component, I think, of why don't we get to a place in society, or can we get to a place in society where we have such a value for life, and such a value for not just the life of the child, but also the life of the woman, that we would not offer her abortion, which ends the life of her child, as a solution, where we recognize that that's not a solution to the issue, that she, as a woman, if we say we care about her and we care about women's empowerment and feminism and all these things, that she deserves better than abortion. And where it's so insufficient and incomprehensible to present abortion as a solution to these broader issues that she's facing, and to someone that we love and care about. Because when I think about the women in my life who might find themselves in crisis pregnancies, and I can think of some who have, the idea that I would present them with this as a solution is heartbreaking to me, because really what those women needed, and I'm thinking of one in particular, is knowing that I would be there no matter what, and knowing that there was a community that supported her, that loved her, that would see her through no matter what the challenge was. And I think that that's something that we've lost to some extent. And so the pro-life worldview is not just an anti-abortion worldview. It is one that says we so value life, and we're so passionate about justice, and we so cherish women and children, that the idea that we would just kind of ignore these issues by offering abortion as kind of a temporary solution is just so unfathomable, because we care too much to offer something that is harmful to women, harmful to their children, harmful to society, and really gives us an easy excuse to not get to the deeper issues of, sexual assault and homelessness and poverty and abuse, domestic violence, these kinds of things. So obviously that's a bigger issue to take on, and we can't go through all of that today, but I think that that's what I hope people understand, is that the pro-life worldview is about so much more than just making abortion illegal. And what I always say, and maybe I'll end with this, Nicole, is
Sure.
is the vision is to get to a place where, even if the laws are permissive, even if the laws said, abortion is allowed, like, all the way to 9 months, as it is in Canada, that we would have built a society that is that embraces women and their children so extensively that no woman would go have an abortion. And so obviously the laws are meant to reflect society, and so if you get to that place in society, there will be legislation that kind of naturally follows, but it's not meant to be this top-down oppressive regime of, we're just going to criminalize abortion and then leave all these women on their own. It's meant to be this beautiful, inspiring, calling society higher, and calling society to actually embrace and cherish women and walk with them through the longer journey of dealing with the crisis pregnancy, supporting her and her child afterwards, as opposed to just offering abortion. So yeah, it's not meant to be this top-down oppressive regime. It's meant to be this beautiful ethic of life. And I, to some extent, we've not always been good as pro-lifers at articulating that, but that's, I think, where I see a lot of people going, and I see a lot of beauty in that. So
absolutely. Yeah. And I think that is then open to each one of us individually to grab onto that life ethic and live it in our own lives with the people around us, and make sure that we are as supportive and loving and there for the people in our lives who need us when they're in crisis. And it's a great opportunity. And then honestly, your work never ends, right? It's always all around you. Well, so thank you so much for coming and speaking with me today. I know that we will be speaking again in the future, because you have a lot of other projects on the go, and I want to talk to you about them, but in due course, when we have more time to do that. But so thank you so much for coming on and speaking with me today. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, it's been a pleasure and a privilege, Nicole. Thank you so much.
Take care.
You too.
Bye.
Bye.